plan the conversation, prepare what you're going to say. Just don't go in and wing it, right? Be very specific about what challenges you're having, the impacts they're having on you. And don't just come in with the problem. You know this. Every manager wants you also to give solutions. Look into what some reasonable workplace accommodations could be and go into your manager saying, here's some suggestions of what I think could help.
Work challenges, self-doubts, and the struggle to be understood. How do you perform in a workplace that doesn't always understand your invisible disability? Hey, Tim here, and thanks for tuning into another episode of the Invisible Condition podcast, where we talk about advocacy and unusually normal things, the conditions, diseases, and illnesses we live with. We will end the stigma of invisible disabilities by empowering voices, and today's voice is brought to us by Debbie Pearmain, an HR expert, leadership development coach, and workplace culture advocate. Debbie's journey in HR and leadership development gives us a unique perspective on creating inclusive spaces. She bridges the gap between supporting individuals with invisible disabilities and also helps workplaces understand the importance of disability inclusion. And in this episode, Debbie shares practical advice on self-advocacy. And really, this is kind of cool, building trust with your manager and then creating compassionate work environments. So if you are struggling with disclosing your condition in the workplace, or maybe you're on the other end and you're leading a workplace and are committed to creating a disability inclusive space, tune in. This episode is for you. Have a listen. Debbie, I am excited to record with you. For those who can't see us, maybe you're listening to the podcast, Debbie and I decided to wear matching glasses today. I love it. That's a good way to start the podcast, black framed glasses. Debbie, you and I go back a number of years. I used to host another podcast for a publication called People Managing People. And we really connected there through your HR experience, through your leadership development experience, and for your workplace culture experience. And I think this is just going to be such a fun podcast for those who live with an invisible condition, and maybe you're navigating the workplace, but maybe you're a leader or in HR and you stumbled upon this episode and are just trying to understand disability inclusion. So before we get into it, Debbie, thanks for joining us. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the people that you support?
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. It's so great to be back and fun to be having this conversation with you. I've been in HR for 25 years, so a long time. I feel like I've seen a lot over my journey in HR. And I'm not sure if you remember, but my initial career actually was in social work. I used to work with at-risk youth. So I definitely have a real, bent towards supporting people, empowering people. So of course I ended up in the people and culture space in HR because HR is a broad field. And I'd say 20 years, I've been doing a lot of just leadership development, employee training, career development, performance management, coaching, culture creation. I do employee engagement surveys. I help create engaging workplaces where employees can flourish. I think you also know I'm a certified flourishing workplace and flourishing life coach. And so I do have my ICF designation as a coach. And so as part of my practice, I work one-on-one with people, helping them to be resilient and just live their best life and try to flourish in the midst of all the change and challenges that we're all living through right now. So that's a little bit about me and my background.
Well, and I think you're a perfect guest for this episode because you do bridge that space of you support individuals as well as you support workplaces. And this is maybe a bit of a different episode than someone coming on and telling their story of an invisible condition, because I wanted to provide a number of podcasts, a number of episodes that support people with an invisible condition. And in this case, how to really navigate this world of work with an invisible condition, specifically how to communicate with your manager. If you need to disclose something in the workplace, what do you do? But before we get into it, there's really thinking about disability inclusion. And I think we need to lay that foundation first. What does disability inclusion mean?
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And so, of course, the last number of years has really shone a spotlight on, HR prioritizing this idea of DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, what does that really mean? It means we are diverse as a species, as human beings, and there's all kinds of differences, right? We've got different genders, different ages, different orientations. We've got, like you said, we've got illnesses, we've got physical disabilities, we have mental health disabilities, different religions, different cultures. And really, especially I think in Canada, we've got this human rights code that protects anyone with a designated disability, as well as wanting to create a diverse multicultural society. So the first place is to really take a look at your life, your workplace, your team. Does it reflect the diversity of our society? Right? So that's the first thing. And how do we then make sure we don't just have teams and workplaces that reflect diversity? Do we treat everyone equally? And of course, from some of the work that
Mm-hmm.
I've done and other people have done in this space, it's we all have biases. Some are conscious, some are unconscious. And there are workplaces, for example, that have diversity, but they don't have equity. Does everyone have access to the same things? There's still, I speak on things like there's still disparity in terms of salaries with genders, right? You've got two people in a management position and a male employee is making more money than a female. So we have a lot of work still to do when it comes to the equity space. And then let's move forward now to what does this word inclusion mean? And it's everyone belongs equally. Everyone feels welcome. And it's, have you been able to create a workplace that is open to differences? So, we could say like neurodiversity as a topic. I do teaching on how to help workplaces create more neurodiverse workplace cultures. Are you recruiting people with neurodiversity? How are you orienting people who are neurodiverse? How are you performance managing them? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel like they belong? And so, yeah, this inclusion piece is really near and dear to my heart because it's everyone belongs, full stop, right? Not just neurotypical people, not just certain genders, not just certain cultures. And if you've ever not felt like you've belonged, right, to a group, the impact that can have on a person's mental health, on their well-being. And so I believe everyone has strengths. And I really work hard to help leaders, managers, HR folks create workplaces that really highlight and utilize a strength-based approach. Right. And there's a lot of work, Tim, that we need to do because we've got some very unflexible and rigid people and workplace structures. But anyways, that's a little bit of my perspective on what we're trying to do when we talk about inclusion.
Yeah, disability inclusion. There's so much
Mm-hmm.
work that needs to be done, and on the flip side, there's so much data
Mm-hmm.
that supports if an organization includes disability in their DEI
Mm-hmm.
or in their inclusion strategy. There's reports from Accenture and Boston Consulting Company and KPMG that say if you support people with disabilities, you will
Oh,
outperform the market.
100%.
That's it. You'll outperform the market. Your employee retention will go up. Your employee morale will go up.
Mm-hmm.
Your revenues will go up. You're broadening your talent pool. But you brought in a key word, which
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
unflexible. I've compiled one of the most comprehensive databases on my website on invisiblecondition.com of invisible conditions and example accommodations. There's over
Yeah.
250 invisible conditions. And the most common word that came up when in this database
Mm.
is flexibility. And we have to embrace flexibility if we want to truly create organizations where
Mm-hmm.
everyone can belong. And that doesn't mean, flexible to go, hey, I'm just going to go work on a beach somewhere. It's flexibility in, hey, I need time off to go to a medical appointment. Or, hey, I'm not feeling well
Mm-hmm.
today. Can I work
Mm-hmm.
from home? Or, hey, can I just always work from home? I get a lot of
Mm-hmm.
work done. Um, there's there's so much that we need to do from not just from a societal perspective, but from a workplace perspective. And when we focus specifically
Mm-hmm.
on the workplace, if somebody lives listening to this and they have an invisible condition, something a non-apparent health condition, and they need to disclose, it's often met with, and I'm speaking
Mm-hmm.
from experience as well as 50 plus interviews I've done,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fear, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stress. So speaking to somebody with an invisible condition, what advice, what would you offer somebody with an invisible condition, who needs to disclose?
Oh my gosh, such a great question. And I feel like we could go in so many different directions. I want to start first by just highlighting something really important that you just said, which is there's 250 invisible conditions. So,
And that's not even complete yet.
no.
There's so many different conditions, so many.
Well, illness, mental health, like, someone could
Hmm.
argue that everything is invisible. I could be sitting here today with a
Hmm.
heart condition and you can't see that. And I think we have to go back to some of these basics. If I think of HR and just this evolution of, mental health in the workplace, I've been working in that space for 15 years, as you know, through TELUS Health, also doing a bit of teaching with the Canadian Mental Health Association. And it's still fascinating to me that when I'm talking to a manager or even other employees, and someone, for example, goes off on a stress leave or short-term disability due to a mental health condition, that people's reactions are like, well, how do you really know that's what's happening? Because we can't see it. And I'm like, it's just like there's so much bias in people's thinking because I literally sitting there and there was a time where I was having heart issues a few years ago. And I was like in those conversations with leaders and saying, well, I have a heart condition right now. Can you see that about me? Right. And it just right away flipped it on its head to get people to understand everyone is struggling with something. So, to even start this conversation, it's how about we create work environments that are compassionate and caring, that everyone comes to
Hmm.
work with something going on. And if it's not something going on with me personally, it could be I might have a child who's struggling. I might have a spouse who's struggling. I might have an in law who's dying. I might have someone that I'm loving and supporting through a cancer journey. Like people are coming to work bringing their whole self. And so, how do we create work environments that are actually open, that are caring, that are compassionate? Regardless of whether we're talking about a physical health issue or a mental health issue or an invisible condition, like it doesn't matter. So let's just start there, coming from a place of care. And then what does that look like? So, your question, obviously, tons of fear will be there if there isn't psychological safety in the first place, right? And so again, let's teach leaders how to create relationships with people where there's psychological safety. And now in Canada, we have these 13 factors that measure psychological safety in a relationship in your organization. It's called the national standard. There's 13 factors. And Tim, I've started, when I do my employee engagement surveys for companies, I've started assessing those 13 factors for psychological health and well-being. Because if trust exists between you and me, and you're my manager, and there's respect there going both ways, then I am going to be more willing to share with you the things in my life that are impacting my ability to perform. And like I'm kind of giving you some of these building blocks, right? So it's like, first, let's create a culture that cares, where there's compassion and understanding. Let's create a culture where there's psychological safety. Let's teach managers how to create trusting, respectful relationships with people. And then the last thing I'm going to say is let's teach leaders and employees about this idea of performance management. And Tim, that has evolved drastically since I started teaching leaders about performance management 25 years ago, right? It was very top down. It was management driven, KPIs. Employees kind of showed up. I remember showing up to my first performance review. I knew nothing about it, didn't know what the form looked like, didn't know what they were assessing, had no input. It was literally done to me. It was a bit of a traumatic experience, to be honest. And I left that thinking there has to be a better way, right? Now, thank goodness, here we are, fast forward 25 years, and I'm now teaching leaders and employees. There's two sides to this relationship. If you truly want to create a high performing, engaging workplace culture, your performance management process needs to be a partnership, and it needs to be collaborative. So if you're my manager, Tim, you've got 50% responsibility for our relationship being successful, but I also own 50% as the employee. And workplaces typically have only been teaching leaders how to manage performance. And then they come to me because they're like, our performance management isn't working. Employees aren't engaged. Like, we're not getting high performance. What's wrong? Well, you've only taught 50% of the relationship how to make this process successful. It would be like you and I being married and one of us going to marriage counseling and then wondering why it wasn't working, right? It's meant to be a partnership. It's meant to be a collaboration. And I am getting to the answer of your question, but it's not a simple answer. As you can see, there's a lot of steps that need to be in place so that if employees understand their 50% of performance management, part of that 50% is I need to come to you as my manager and tell you the barriers that are getting in the way of me being successful. And there needs to be the safety, the trust, and the respect in the relationship for me to be open and honest with you. That's a piece of what I own in this relationship and in this performance management partnership. And the piece then that the manager owns is to ask the questions, right? Is to recognize signs that someone's performance is struggling, and then to sit down with that person and inquire to find out why. So we do in Canada have something called the duty to inquire. So if I notice your performance is not what it usually is, then I have a duty as your manager to say, hey, Tim, what's happening for you lately? Because these are some things I've observed, and this is a change in you. These are some things I'm experiencing, and this isn't like you. Like, is everything okay? That's the duty to inquire. Now, when there's trust and safety in the relationship, you then, as the employee, doing your 50% to remove the barriers, if you felt safe and comfortable, might say, you know what, Debbie, I'm struggling with my anxiety. And, normally I'm pretty high functioning, but just recently something happened in my life. I don't need to tell you what that is. And it's really starting to affect me. And I'm noticing that, it's harder for me to make decisions. I'm not sleeping as well. I'm noticing this is going on also in my performance. Could you imagine if we could have workplaces where we are teaching managers and employees how to work together in this way? And then, Tim, as the caring, supportive manager, not the counselor or the therapist. Your job at that point is to then say, okay, so what are the challenges you're having from a performance perspective? How can I help you overcome those challenges? Like, here's where you're performing, here's where I need you to be, this is the gap that exists. What strategies can we put in place to remove those barriers? And they could be as simple as just helping you prioritize your workload, or it could get into this area of accommodations, right? And again, in Canadian workplaces, managers have a duty to accommodate. So I just want to lay that foundation for you as we now start to unpack a lot of what I just said. So, yes, there's a ton of fear because most workplaces don't do any of the things that I just mentioned to you. And we can do better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's so many workplaces. There are workplaces that are progressive and are taking action on this.
Yeah, they're
And
getting there.
but I keep coming across workplaces that keep saying, "Well, I don't have the budget." Well, you don't need a budget to be a place of work of good people that actually care. Yeah, sure, maybe you need to bring in an external facilitator to do some training and all that good stuff. But to be a good employer, you don't need a budget for that. You just show up as a good human. It's not that hard.
Well, I mean, I love that you just said that, Tim. And sadly, it kind of is that hard because here's the thing. Every time I do engagement surveys, depending on whatever the issues are that companies are experiencing, we can honestly, if we take a hard look at ourselves, direct most of that back to whoever's in leadership, right? So caring, compassionate companies start with caring, compassionate leaders. And sadly, I mean, I also speak to a lot of CEO groups across the country through various CEO organizations. And I specifically go in there and speak to them around topics of mental health, right? And around how do we create an engaging workplace culture when currently, right now, 2 out of 5 Canadians are struggling with their mental health, right? This is a hard topic right now for companies. And I still just had this happen to me 2 weeks ago in a room of CEOs, had a number of people dismiss me right at the beginning of my presentation. I was there for 3 hours. And their attitudes very clearly is, I'm here to make money. I'm running a business. This isn't my problem. So as much as we think, oh, this is simple, I'm like, no. And I can absolutely tell you that that person's organization in the next 5 years will have massive issues with turnover, with attracting and retaining good people, because one of the most important things that employees are looking for today is workplaces that care, workplaces that are flexible, workplaces that are supportive, and workplaces that they are able to integrate their work and personal lives in a healthy way.
And if we think about just workplaces, and even on that topic of performance, I'm speaking to leaders, HR people, but even individuals right now, it's, if we start measuring things that matter, instead of measuring time at your computer and putting in performance KPIs around that, what if we put in KPIs around specific goals and measure specific goals? And so for me, in any team that I've led throughout my career, here's your goals. We know that my management has agreed to these goals. So if it takes you 6 hours a day to get this stuff done, I don't care, because we're going to get this done. Now, if you're only putting in 6 hours of work, sure, you're check your performance. But here's an opportunity for you to then get hungry and want to learn more. And so, bringing it back to specifically invisible conditions in the workplace, I love how you've summarized it. Yeah, it's high level and it's complicated, but it doesn't have to be that complicated, because if you're listening to this, Debbie's just outlined a high level roadmap for you. I have an invisible condition, and I've often feared disclosing. And I know there's a
Mm,
duty to accommodate, there's reasonable accommodations, there's human rights protections for me and for
mm,
people like me, specifically here in Canada, but also in the US. US is a little bit more complicated, uh, but
mhm,
there is fear. I live with Crohn's disease. You look at me, I quote
mhm,
unquote look normal. Don't like that word. I wrote a blog about it. You can go read it. But I'm my version of normal. I'm missing most of my large intestine. So my body functions very differently than somebody who
mhm,
has all of their intestines. I have
mhm.
feared sharing that. I also live
Mm,
with anxiety and depression. Uh,
mhm,
and I don't share that very often because I don't want that to
mhm,
affect my opportunity for a future contract or future employment.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so how do we how do we support someone who is struggling to disclose,
mhm,
and it is affecting their work, and they know it's affecting their
mhm,
work, but there's so much fear in disclosing because there might not have that trusting relationship. So speaking specifically to somebody who has an invisible condition,
mhm.
what would you offer that person?
Yeah, what a great question. And I mean, first of all, I'll just, share as well that I have lived experience with mental health, both anxiety, depression, as well as PTSD. And so I can completely relate to the fear that you're talking about. And I think a lot of this has to do with our own personal journeys of self acceptance, right? And I also, I do a lot of coaching with people around things like self acceptance and self compassion. Because when we can accept ourselves, right, for who we are and what is going on in our bodies without judgment, now this becomes the self compassion piece. It's empowering when we recognize that there's nothing actually wrong with us and it's not our fault, right? So these things have happened, whether it's because of genetics, whether it's because of environmental factors, whether it's because of abuse. Like there's so many contributing factors to any invisible condition. And I think helping us get to this place of self acceptance then helps us develop self compassion. We're so great at maybe having compassion for someone else who's experiencing something difficult. And yet I know myself and a lot of the people I coach struggle with a very strong, internal critic or judge. And as long as that's what's going on, right, then that is what's going to prevent us from self management and self advocacy, right? So there's kind of these pillars that when I'm working with someone, coaching them around this idea of flourishing, a lot of that is accepting who you are, where you're at, what's going on for you, having compassion for yourself so that you then can advocate for what it is that you need. And I look at what we're talking about here today, going back to this place of what is it that the employee can control in the relationship with their manager? It's to know who they are, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. So, what is helping them be successful? What are the barriers getting in the way of their success? What do they need to thrive and be successful? And then the next step, once we do that with people, once I've worked with people to help them get to that place, the next step for them is now, how can I help you to start self advocating, which is the speaking up and the being honest and being open and sharing and being assertive. And this is where agency comes in. And you are absolutely right. Fear keeps us quiet, right? Fear keeps us hiding. I remember the first time I ever got up in a group full of people and talked about my mental health, and I was shaking. I broke out in hives. I was bawling my eyes out. Like it was an extremely scary, stressful experience for me. And when I got to the other side of that, And the way that people kind of embraced me and like said, you were so brave. And like, I'm so grateful you shared that. And, then people started sharing things with me that they had been going through. It was like there was freedom on the other side, right? But Tim, that was like one conversation at a time. That was 15 years ago. Fast forward to where I am now today, where I speak at conferences, on podcasts. I teach about this in the workplace. No questions are off limits. I don't get stressed at all. That didn't happen overnight. So my encouragement for the people who would be listening to this podcast is start with the relationships where you do feel safe. Start opening up to the people in your life that you do trust, right? Where there is that safe attachment, and see how they respond to you.
Yeah.
Right. And just get your feet wet, starting to advocate for yourself in those relationships. You don't go from not doing any of that to like doing that to the relationship with your boss that has the greatest amount of risk and fear. Like that would be like you saying, Debbie, I want to start hiking. And I'm like, great, next week we're doing Mount Everest. Are you ready? Like, right? So I'd be like, start talking more honestly with your spouse or your best friend, even your children. Like, build up some confidence, build up that muscle of even assertiveness, asking for what you want and need. And eventually, right, then through counseling, through coaching, through support, as your confidence grows, you then can maybe tackle that difficult conversation with the manager. And I would also say, right, then these practices that I teach in my workshops around having difficult conversations are also really helpful. So plan the conversation, prepare what you're going to say. Just don't go in and wing it, right? Be very specific about what challenges you're having, the impacts they're having on you. And don't just come in with the problem. You know this. Every manager wants you also to give solutions. I think the hardest part I hear from managers, even around accommodations, is like, my employee came in the other day and just dropped this bomb on me or dropped this on my lap and then left. And now I'm sitting holding it and I have no idea how to fix it or what to do about it. So even, as like you're doing your preparation and research, look into what some reasonable workplace accommodations could be. Mm-hmm. And go into your manager saying, here's some suggestions of what I think could help. Would you be open? Would you be willing for us to try this and just see, right? Because every manager is going to be afraid. If I say yes to this, other people are going to ask for it. What kind of impact's that going to have on your performance? So I also think employees have to think of the other person in the conversation. What might their questions be? What might their concerns be? What challenges might that pose for them? So I can absolutely, in a coaching conversation, support a listener to help navigate how to have that conversation. And I even do role playing with people. It's like, now that you have your plan, you've thought it through, like, let's do a half-hour coaching call and I'll pretend to be your manager. And you come in and let's practice and I'll throw out the question. Like, let's help you build that muscle. Let's help you build that confidence.
It absolutely is a muscle. And, maybe somebody's listening to this and is scared, is full of fear, and not fear of maybe that other person's reaction, but just fear of like stepping out and bringing up the conversation. You feel exposed, you feel vulnerable. But I would say, without a doubt, 100% of everyone I've talked to has felt that weight lifted off of them when they have opened up vulnerably. Because it honestly has opened up so many conversations. Well, not just for myself, but even for every podcast guest. I heard from a podcast guest who was on and was speaking super honestly and vulnerably. And he had numerous people reach out and say, hey, thank you for sharing that. This is what I'm struggling with as well. And it is building out friendships. It's building out um, the community, and
Community.
that's the big word. And you're right, it doesn't happen overnight. And there's an article up on the site, and it talks about self-advocacy, and it really starts with why it matters to you, why it matters to someone. What are your values? What are you hoping to get out of this? And for a manager or an HR person, or even a family member who's listening to this, and the data is crystal clear. The 1 in 4 of us live with some sort of illness, disability, disease. That's either in the US or in Canada. I think it's over 16% of the world population live with a disability. So there's a lot of us. So somebody, if you're listening to this and go, well, I don't know anybody with a disability. Yes, you do. If you know more than 4 people, you know somebody. And so think about, maybe they haven't disclosed. And think about that for a moment, whether you're in the workplace or in your friend group or in your family. Maybe it isn't a trusting relationship. Maybe there's more that you can offer. But for somebody who needs to disclose for whatever reason, maybe it's for an accommodation, or they just need to build that community. Think about all that brain power, that effort it takes to not disclose, and to hide,
Masking.
right? To hide who you truly are is exhausting, as you said. So just think about that for a moment. Just, if you're listening to this, just pause there for a moment and just think about that massive impact on our friends, our family, our colleagues. And I love that you talked about just honing in on that communication skill, and adapted a model, a feedback model called situation behavior impact, the SBI feedback model. I love it.
I love
Simple. And so I've kind of adapted it over the last year into situation, feelings, impact, and the need. So what is the situation? How is it impact? How are you feeling? What is the impact, and what do you need? Because you said, as a manager, you need a solution, right? There's askjan.org, great database of accommodations. The one on invisiblecondition.com. Another great company is disclo.com, so you can check them out. There's so many resources out there to support disability inclusion from a manager and HR perspective, but also an individual perspective. And it's complex. It's not as easy as like, hey, now I'm a trusting leader. Tell me everything and let's unlock your performance. It takes, you need to demonstrate it. And the person who needs to disclose or wants to disclose, or if something is affecting your performance, it takes courage and vulnerability. But
and like one conversation at a time, right? We build trust with people one conversation at a time, and we damage trust with people one conversation at a time. So I would say if someone is brave enough to be open with you about something that they are struggling with, then the best thing that you, I, or anyone listening on this can do is just be thankful and thank them, right? For being brave enough to share with you what they shared. And ask, how can you help? How can you support? And again, I think lots of leaders are afraid to even have that conversation with people, because then they don't know what to do with the information they receive. And part of the teaching I do in workplaces, again, around disability management and mental health, is to help leaders understand their role, right? They're not there to become the person's counselor or therapist. They're there to create a work environment that supports people's strengths and helps minimize weaknesses and barriers. And also, their job is to be a bridge to whatever resources and supports that the employer provides, and get to know resources and supports that are available in the community that they work in. So there's a lot, even just, like you said, if people are listening to this from the HR perspective, one of the things I say to HR folks is, compile a list of all the community-based resources that support people in your workplace. So beyond your EAP program, beyond your benefits provider, here's all the other community-based resources that are there to support you if you're struggling with anything. So people know where they can go for help, right? There is help available. There are resources. Most people just don't know where to look. And I would then even say things like, if someone's listening to this with an invisible condition, they're struggling with their workplace, If you have an EAP provider, that's a great place to start, right? It's free. It's 100% confidential. You can get, maybe 5 sessions working with a counselor or a coach who can help you navigate this, who can help you develop the courage, the confidence, the tools, the skills to even have a conversation with your manager about this. But I would absolutely agree with you on the hiding something because you feel shame or you feel judgment drains so much of our energy. It's exhausting. And so if you can, present what's happening for you in a way that helps people understand what you need and clearly articulate and communicate how your manager or workplace can better support you to be successful, right? That's truly, I think, the goal of what we're hoping to get to in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much packed already into this conversation for both those living with an invisible condition. Maybe you're in HR, maybe you're a manager, maybe you're just looking to learn more about disability inclusion. And, it starts with, having that conversation, but understanding for yourself, living with it, maybe you live with an invisible condition, maybe you're caring for someone, why it matters to you. Start there. Just grab a piece of paper, write it down, talk to yourself on your phone, send yourself a text, whatever. Why does it matter? And start having that internal conversation, because that will set the framework to then communicate outwards. And maybe you're struggling. Maybe you don't have access to an EAP. Reach out. Reach out to myself, Debbie. I'll invite her to share her contact information as well here in a minute. There's people here that want to support you. And if cost is a barrier for you, let me know. How can I support you? Let's create places, workplaces that people can truly thrive, that you can truly thrive. And Debbie, as we wrap up, I ask this to all my guests. Invisible condition exists to end this stigma. Like this project that I've working on, which is turning out to be more than a project, is really just to end this stigma, to empower voices and ignite social change. How are we going to end the stigma that surrounds invisible conditions?
I mean, again, this goes back to, like you said, creating like good humans. And so that's one relationship at a time, right? So I think of myself as a parent, and yes, there's all these goals, right, that we're trying to, get our kids through elementary school, high school, get them to university, get them in the world of work, get them to move out of the house, right? Like there's all, like, I guess, the KPIs of parenting. But early on, my husband and I sat down and we're like, at the end of the day, like, we're shaping humans. And so what kind of people do we want our kids to grow up to be? What kind of character do we want them to have? What kind of values do we want them to have? And how can we help teach them those things? Right. And again, I'm going to say, my hope is HR folks are thinking these same things. Leaders are thinking these same things. And just even as you said, that just people are thinking about this. So, I mean, if I want to have healthy, good relationships with people, one of the things that I really want to be able to do is be open to differences. And there's still so many folks out there who struggle to accept people who are different from them. And we're more different than we are the same. So it's about being open to differences. And then it's, do I strive in my relationships for there to be equality? So if I'm in a relationship with someone who's different from me, do I have biases? And yes, we all do, conscious and unconscious. So have I spent any time getting to know my own unconscious biases? And there's lots of, free assessments that you can do online to help you become aware of your own unconscious bias. And then it's, again, go back to inclusion and belonging. Like, I want everyone I interact with to feel that they belong as they are. So what does that look like in my relationships with people? Do I only accept people who show up perfectly? Right? Do I leave relationships when there's a problem? Do I cut people off if there's conflict? Like, these are all things that, as you say being a good human, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Can I tolerate differences? And getting to even know, like, your triggers, right? What are those things that trigger you? Because the bigger your triggers, the more apparent that is a bias of some kind or a judgment of some kind that you have about a topic, right? So as you get to know yourself, and then, as you said, self-reflect, what kind of human being do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
Am I helping people feel that way that are in relationship with me? And I would say for myself, just on the mental health piece, it's also just, as I've become more accepting of myself, my confidence has actually increased. And, developing self-compassion has helped my confidence increase. And so the more that I can be open and honest and share with other people, that's helping break down stigma. And it's also helping create more authentic relationships with people. So, I don't know, Tim, I do a lot of work in helping workplaces break down stigma. And so I hope that even just some of the things I've shared are giving your listeners some ideas.
Absolutely. Maybe somebody, again, is listening to this who lives with an invisible condition. Here's an episode that you can just share with your workplace. Just send it out. Send it to everybody. Send it to your manager. Send it to HR, and say, hey, if you're, this is an opportunity for us as a workplace, as a team, to do more or to do better. Or maybe you're working in an organization that fully supports you, and you can say, look, we're validated now. Here's an episode to validate the work that we're doing. And it's not just a checklist of here's 5 things you need to do and then we're done and we never need to worry about it again. We're humans, we're complex. Every day is different. We have things coming up in our personal life that may change daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and that affects our performance. And so being able to create that trusting relationship within our workplaces will help us, dare I use the word, thrive. It'll help us perform. It'll help us feel that we are included. And you know what? For me, if I feel included, man, I'm going to perform for you. I am going to, I will stick around. I will create revenue, whether you're for profit or not for profit. I'm going to drive this business forward. So it's good for business. It's good for everyone. And so, Debbie, as we wrap up, I just want to give our listeners an opportunity to, if they want to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, where can people find you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I before I do that, I'll just say I completely echo. If we can create real diversity, equity, inclusion, right, in our relationships, in our workplaces, that 100% impacts engagement, commitment, loyalty, retention, productivity, work quality, creativity, like all those things, right? So, yeah, I love and am passionate about helping people do that in their relationships, but also helping workplaces to create environments like that. And so I would just say One Stop HR, and it's onestophr.ca. So the Canadian One Stop HR. And of course, my name is Debbie Pearmain. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And my website has my email address and my contact info as well. So I am happy always for people to email me questions, point people in the right direction, point people to resources. I will just say, you made a comment about counseling, and if your company doesn't have an EAP program, there are a lot of free resources now available, even for things like counseling. So the Canadian Mental Health Association has some great programs. They have a 6-week program called Bounce Back. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a 6-week coaching program. It's free and it's self-referred. So you don't need a doctor's referral. You don't need to tell anyone. You can just go on their website. You can refer yourself. You can register for this. That's a great start for folks. And I also just saw, I love following very positive, supportive people on Instagram. And I just saw BetterHelp is offering free counseling for the month of June. So that's an app, right? It's a counseling app. And I've even just seen counseling platforms now that are offering counseling at $45 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, you don't have to spend $200 an hour to get the help and support you need. I do coaching, not counseling. So like I said, flourishing life coaching, flourishing workplace coaching. But I also do those engagement assessments. I do lots of training for leaders and employees in companies. And I also do consulting. So I'm happy to support your listeners in any of those capacities as well.
I love that, Debbie. And yeah, for those who are listening, we'll include that in the show notes. So head to invisiblecondition.com/podcast, and you can search out Debbie's episode and all that information there. And for those who are listening, I really appreciate you. I appreciate all the comments I get, the feedback I get. And if you have a moment, please rate us. I know that helps us go a long ways in making sure people find and discover invisiblecondition.com. Please share this episode out and all episodes out with your friends, your family, your colleagues. And I have two small asks. One is please subscribe to the invisiblecondition.com newsletter. This is a great place for resources, for articles. I'm spending a significant amount of time writing articles and creating resources, free resources for people right now. As well as if you have a few dollars, maybe consider donating to help with the production of this episode as well as other episodes. That would be helpful as well. So with that, Debbie and listeners, I hope you have an amazing day.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. And I will also say your Instagram posts are great. So for listeners to also check you out on Instagram, and you've got lots of good clips from past guests. And I've really enjoyed, your posts, and just so grateful for the work that you're doing in this space as well. So thank you for all you do. And thanks for having me today.
Appreciate you, Debbie. Take care.